Thank you for the introduction. And before we start, I'd like to mention that this paper is a collaboration with Nextcloud. And along those lines, I'd like to give a quick shout out to my awesome collaborators. You can see them on the slides. So I'm sure many of the people in this room are familiar with the term of self-hosting. But for those who are not, I'd like to give a brief definition. So what we mean by self-hosting is the maintenance of hard and/or software components for services on your own, as opposed to buying access to these services from a third party. So you're basically not relying on software as a service providers, but you're doing everything your own. People can have varying levels of hardware and software control, but we assume that they have at least a dedicated installation. So self-hostable software is available for a magnitude of different use cases. Just to name a few, we have file storage options. There can be email that you can self-host, calendars, password managers, DNS servers, and so on. As a brief motivation for this work, I want you to consider the screenshot I took from a post of an online forum where people discuss topics that are related to self-hosting. And what you can see here is one of the users who recognized that a lot of people have trouble securing their instances or don't have any protections at all. And this is why this particular person came up with a guide to help people. And this exemplifies how self-hosters commonly find themselves thrown in at the deep end of suddenly being responsible for an internet-facing service. And in this context, I think it's very interesting to note that self-hosters are in this case a special population because they become administrators without necessarily having the relevant technical expertise or experience. So they are basically an intermediate group between end users and professional administrators. And this is how our work ties into this motivation. So the goal is for us to explore the different dimensions of self-hosting. And the results we have hopefully can inform the development of helpful advice, information sources, and also steer the development of tooling for the self-hosting community. So we looked at 3 different dimensions. We looked at motivation, we looked at operation, and at security. And we are also interested in how these different dimensions can create tensions and interact with each other. We study self-hosting on the test bed of Nextcloud. So for the people who are not familiar with Nextcloud, it's a large open source project. It has a big community that's very active. And the core use case is file storage and file synchronization. But Nextcloud also has an app store attached to it, which broadens the use cases also to email, for example, and communication. So what we did in this work is we had a 2-step approach. We had this Nextcloud community survey that consisted of 994 users. And we developed it in coordination with the Nextcloud community. And we gathered data about the instances. And we combined this large and broad high-level data with individual in-depth insights by doing semi-structured interviews with selected survey participants. That way, we are able to recruit a very diverse sample. So we had people who self-host privately, but we also had people who do it commercially. So for example, there were travel agencies, but also bigger industrial corporations. We also had nonprofit organizations such as schools, universities, and also political parties. Users came from over 16 different countries with varying levels of expertise. So we had professional administrators who hosted instances for over 20 years, but we also have people who have never done that before. And in terms of the infrastructure, it's also diverse. So we have people who have home servers like Raspberry Pis under their table, but also people who give away hardware control and rely on virtual private servers. So next up, I'd like to walk you through different dimensions and give you a brief overview of our results, starting with motivation. So what we found are 7 different motivational factors. And I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to highlight basically opposing motivational factors, starting with people who are driven by normative ethical values. So across all groups, normative-driven self-hosters practice self-hosting because they see it as the right thing to do. So that means they either have a general socio-political values that are aligned with self-hosting. So for example, they could see privacy as a fundamental human right, and therefore they are self-hosting because they think that by self-hosting they are exerting their right to privacy. Or it could also be professional ethical values. So for example, we had lawyers and journalists who say they have to protect their clients' data and they cannot rely on big corporations to do that for them. More on the other spectrum, we have also people, that would be the light blue here, who are more use case driven, and you can see that's also a big chunk of users across all user groups. And use case driven people are more pragmatic, so they self-host because they have a use case that they need to fulfill, and there is self-hostable software out there available that's of high quality and that serves this use case. And then there are also some people that's mostly personal users, so you can see it's the bright orange in the personal column, who do it just for the fun. Next up, I'd like to talk about operator constellations. So we considered self-hosting as a socially embedded activity, and by doing that, we were able to identify 5 different types of operator constellations. So first we have 2 types where people work alone to keep their instances up and running. So we have the sole operators who are more like, say, like lone wolves doing it on their own. Maybe they're embedded online, but in general they don't have friends or anybody to help them run their instance. And the main difference to organizational embedded sole hosters is that those are working usually in a corporation or on a non-profit organization. Then, as a third category, we have people that are basically at the intersection, like transitional to people who work in groups. So it would be people that do knowledge bartering. So they are relying on a third party for administration and security practices. But it's not an official contract, but it's more an exchange of mutual favors. And then we have people working in groups. So we have collaborative networks. They are a corporation of multiple individuals based on their personal traits rather than organizational structures. And these collaborative networks emerge bottom up, so people are united by a common goal. So for example, we had a privacy community out there, and they work together in order to enable everybody to have private data on their own servers. And then last but not least, we have also team members within organizations. So that would maybe be the more classical approach to server administration, where you have groups of administrators working together, sharing tasks, but they're being constrained by organizational policies. As a third dimension, I'd like to briefly talk about security mindsets and practices as well. In the paper, we have information about attacker models, perceived risks, trust anchors, defensive mechanisms, and also maintenance practices as a facet of security. But you can read about those in the paper. I'm not going to talk about them here. What I want you to take away is that the majority of people in the survey say that the security of the Nextcloud instance is a concern to them. So they are thinking about security, or they're at least worried about it. And along those lines, I'd like to talk about gaps in their security mindsets now. So in general, people like across all user groups, we had people who did very well, so who did threat modeling and other stuff as well. But we also had people across all groups that had lacking security practices and gaps in their mindsets. So one example of that would be people who don't indulge in any kind of attacker modeling, so they are not really aware who could be an attacker to the system. So you can consider this quote, for example, when being asked who could be an attacker, this person said that anybody could be an attacker, basically, and anyone who can afford a person that's skilled or motivated for some months would be able to access their data. And this is their rough estimation, but it's actually based on nothing. Then additionally, prioritizing risk was very hard for people. So they were actually quite creative when it came to identifying potential vulnerabilities, but then prioritizing those was very challenging. So as this person said, I learn what I can, but server security feels like a bottomless pit. And then, last but not least, also the identification of defensive mechanisms is very challenging. So people don't really know what to pick over what and why. And that can lead to people opting for defensive mechanisms that are, say, quote-unquote catch-all defenses. So for example, firewalls were very popular, and that can also lead to a false sense of security. So for example, this person said, I don't have to pay any attention to what services are running and what ports they have open because this person has a firewall. Okay, so what I want you to take away here is that the motivation, operation, and security practices are connected in non-obvious ways. And people sometimes enter special operator constellations in order to cope with their educational drawbacks. And then, in general, security is often approached in an unstructured way, although we also had people across all user groups who did it like very thoroughly. Thank you for your attention, and you can find the link to the paper on the right. If you are into scanning QR codes, you can do that as well. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.